17 Black famous musicians in their youth that will shock you. Before the fame, the awards, and the sold-out arenas, some of music's biggest black legends were already showing extraordinary talent as children and teenagers. They were mastering instruments, winning competitions, writing songs, and performing professionally years before the world knew their names. Stay to the end and subscribe to Black Legends Revealed for more incredible stories behind the music. Stevie Wonder. Stevie Wonder, born Stevland Hardaway Morris, is one of the most influential singers, songwriters, and multi-instrumentalists in American music. But what makes his story extraordinary is how early that talent appeared. Blind shortly after birth, Stevie was already playing piano, harmonica, and drums by age 9, largely developing his musical ability through sound and instinct. By age 10, his singing and musicianship were attracting attention around his Detroit neighborhood. His ability eventually reached Motown, and in 1961, when he was only 11, the company signed him and introduced him professionally as Little Stevie Wonder. He was not simply a child vocalist. Motown recognized a youngster capable of singing, writing, and handling several instruments at an unusually high level. How many 11-year-olds could walk into Motown and convince one of America's hottest record companies that they already belonged among professional musicians? The real shock came only 2 years later. At 13, Wonder scored a major breakthrough with the live recording Fingertips Pete 2. The song reached #1, turning a teenage multi-instrumentalist into a national star before he was old enough to drive. His abilities kept expanding. Wonder studied classical piano and music theory, developed as a songwriter, and by his late teens was already moving beyond the image of a child prodigy. Long before Superstition or Songs in the Key of Life, Stevie Wonder had already done something remarkable. He entered Motown as a child and proved that his talent was mature enough to compete with adults. Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson was an American singer, songwriter, and dancer who would eventually become known around the world as the King of Pop. But decades before Thriller, the Moonwalk, and stadium tours, Michael was a small boy from Gary, Indiana, performing beside his older brothers in the Jackson 5. By 1969, he was only 11 when the group reached national television audiences, including their famous appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. Old photographs from that period show a Michael very different from the image later generations remember: a round, youthful face, a large, natural afro, colorful stage outfits, and an almost constantly smiling expression. Yet behind that childlike appearance was already an unusually polished performer. After signing with Motown, the Jackson 5 exploded onto the charts with I Want You Back, followed by ABC, The Love You Save, and I'll Be There. Remarkably, all 4 of their first Motown singles reached #1. If you had seen Michael at 11 years old, would you have imagined that this little boy would become one of the most recognizable entertainers in history? His solo career also began while he was still remarkably young. In 1972, at just 13, he released Got to Be There and Then Ben. The title song, Ben, became his first #1 single as a solo artist. Looking back at Michael's youth is striking because the transformation was enormous before the elaborate costumes and carefully constructed superstar image. He was already carrying a level of fame and responsibility that most children would never experience. Prince. Prince Rogers Nelson was a Minneapolis-born singer, songwriter, producer, and multi-instrumentalist who would later become one of the most original figures in modern music. But long before Purple Rain or 1999, his talent was already obvious. As a child, Prince became fascinated by his father's piano, and by around age 7, he was teaching himself melodies from television themes by ear. By junior high, music had become more than a hobby. Prince formed an early band with Andre Anderson, later known as Andre Simone, and spent hours moving between instruments, rehearsing and absorbing everything from funk and soul to rock and jazz. His group Grand Central became one of the youngest and hottest bands on Minneapolis's North Side, playing school dances and competing in local battles of the bands. How many teenagers could hear a full arrangement in their head and then personally play nearly every part needed to bring it to life? That ability stunned people once Prince entered a professional studio. At just 18, manager Owen Husney heard a demo and initially assumed an entire band was playing. He was told it was actually one teenager singing and performing all the instruments himself. Within weeks, Warner Brothers A&M and Columbia were all competing to sign him. Prince ultimately chose Warner Brothers and won extraordinary creative control. For his 1978 debut album, For You, released when he was 19, he produced, arranged, composed, and performed the record himself, playing 27 different instruments across the sessions. Before the world knew Prince as a superstar, he was already operating like an entire band, songwriter, arranger, and producer, all before turning 20. Nina Simone. Nina Simone was an American singer, pianist, songwriter, and civil rights activist whose deep voice and classical technique made her one of the most distinctive musicians of the 20th century. But long before the world knew Nina Simone, she was Eunice Kathleen Wayman, a gifted child from Tryon, North Carolina, who began playing piano at about 3 or 4 years old and dreamed of becoming a classical concert pianist. Her talent became obvious almost immediately. At around 11 or 12, Eunice gave a classical recital in her hometown. Before she began playing, her parents were forced to surrender their front row seats to white audience members. Simone later recalled refusing to perform until her parents were allowed to return to the front. That moment stayed with her for decades. A local fund helped finance her musical education, and she eventually attended a private school, graduated as valedictorian, and studied piano intensely before attending Juilliard in New York. Looking at that quiet, young pianist, would you have imagined she would someday become one of America's fiercest musical voices for racial equality? Her original plan was not to become a jazz or soul singer at all. She wanted admission to Philadelphia's prestigious Curtis Institute of Music, but her application was rejected, an experience Simone later attributed to racial discrimination. Needing money for further lessons, she began performing at an Atlantic City bar in 1954. When the owner insisted she sing as well as play piano, her career unexpectedly changed direction. She adopted the name Nina Simone partly to hide her nightclub work from her deeply religious mother. The commanding woman audiences later saw on stage had begun as a disciplined little girl practicing classical piano with an entirely different future in mind. Gladys Knight. Gladys Knight is an American R&B and soul singer who would eventually become known as the Empress of Soul. But her extraordinary voice was turning heads long before adulthood. Born in Atlanta in 1944, Knight began singing gospel at Mount Moriah Baptist Church when she was only 4 years old, already performing publicly while most children her age were just starting school. Her first major breakthrough came at just 7. In 1952, Knight appeared on the nationally televised Ted Mack's Original Amateur Hour and won the grand prize after performing Too Young. The victory reportedly earned her $2,000, a remarkable achievement for a child who had barely begun elementary school. How many 7-year-olds could walk onto national television, sing in front of strangers, and leave as the competition's grand prize winner? Only a year later, Knight's family formed the Pips, named after cousin James Pip Woods. The original lineup included Gladys, her brother Bubba, her sister Brenda, and cousins William and Eleanor Guest. Even though Gladys was only 8, her powerful church-trained voice naturally placed her at the center of the group. During the 1950s, the young group began working the performance circuit, and by 1960, Knight was only 16 when the group released its first album. Years before, Midnight Train to Georgia made her a soul legend. Gladys Knight had already spent most of her childhood performing professionally. Her later success did not appear overnight. The remarkable part is that the voice millions eventually recognized had already been winning national audiences before Gladys Knight was even 10 years old. Herbie Hancock. Herbie Hancock is an American pianist-composer and one of the most influential figures in modern jazz. Long before the synthesizer's Grammy Awards and futuristic sound of rocket, he was a classically trained child prodigy from Chicago. Hancock began playing piano at 7, and by 11 he had already reached a stage most musicians never experience: orchestra hall with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. On February 5, 1952, the 7th grader performed the first movement of Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 26 after winning the orchestra's youth auditions. In photographs from his youth, Hancock looked remarkably clean-cut and reserved, a slim young student whose future seemed more likely to be classical music or science than groundbreaking jazz. During high school, however, he became fascinated with jazz, listening closely to musicians such as Oscar Peterson and Bill Evans. At Grinnell College, his interests stretched beyond music. He studied both music and electrical engineering, an early combination of art and technology that would later become central to his career. Could anyone watching that 11-year-old boy play Mozart have imagined he would later help change the sound of jazz itself? After college, Hancock began working with trumpeter Donald Byrd and quickly entered New York's jazz world. His 1962 debut album Taken Off included Watermelon Man, which became one of his earliest signature compositions. Then came an extraordinary leap. At only 23, Miles Davis invited Hancock into his celebrated quintet. Before becoming an electronic music pioneer, Hancock had already lived several musical lives: classical prodigy, engineering student, jazz composer, and Miles Davis sideman, all while still remarkably young. Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin was an American singer, pianist, and songwriter who would eventually become known worldwide as the Queen of Soul. But years before Respect or Think, her extraordinary voice was already astonishing people inside her father's church in Detroit. Largely self-taught on piano, Aretha learned to play by ear and began singing gospel while still a child. Her father, the nationally known preacher, Reverend C.L. Franklin, led New Bethel Baptist Church, where the Franklin family regularly encountered gospel giants including Mahalia Jackson, Clara Ward, and James Cleveland. By about 12 years, Aretha was traveling with her father's gospel tours, singing and accompanying herself on piano before congregations around the country. How many teenagers could stand beside established gospel singers and already possess a voice powerful enough to sound fully formed? At only 14, Franklin made some of her earliest recordings inside New Bethel Baptist Church. Released locally in 1956, performances such as Never Grow Old and Precious Lord captured a teenager whose phrasing, gospel, piano, and emotional intensity already pointed toward the artist she would become. By her late teens, Franklin was ready to move beyond the gospel circuit. In 1960, at 18, she went to New York and signed with Columbia Records, beginning her professional secular recording career. Long before the world crowned Aretha Franklin the Queen of Soul, audiences had already heard something remarkable. A teenage girl singing with the authority, control, and emotional depth of an artist decades older. Wynton Marsalis. Wynton Marsalis is an American trumpeter, composer, and bandleader who became one of the most recognizable figures in modern jazz. But his story began in New Orleans, where he grew up surrounded by music as the son of pianist and teacher Ellis Marsalis Jr. At 6, Wynton received his first trumpet from legendary New Orleans trumpeter Al Hirt. By 8, he was performing traditional jazz in Danny Barker's Fairview Baptist Church Band. Although he did not begin seriously studying the instrument until about 12, his progress after that was remarkably fast. At 14, Marsalis performed Haydn's Trumpet Concerto with the New Orleans Philharmonic. He also played in marching bands, funk groups, jazz ensembles, and youth orchestras, absorbing several musical worlds while still a teenager. At 17, he became the youngest musician admitted to Tanglewood's Berkshire Music Center and received its Harvey Shapiro Award for Outstanding Brass Student. If you had watched Wynton perform a classical concerto at 14, would you have guessed that jazz would eventually become the center of his life? In 1979, the 17-year-old Marsalis moved to New York to study classical trumpet at Juilliard. Yet the city's jazz scene quickly pulled him in another direction. He sat in with drummer Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers that same year and formally joined the group in 1980. By 19, Marsalis was already touring with his own band. Before the Grammys and international acclaim, Marsalis had already moved from a 6-year-old with a gifted trumpet to one of America's most formidable young musicians. Ray Charles. Ray Charles was an American singer, pianist, and songwriter whose mixture of gospel, blues, jazz, and R&B helped reshape popular music. But before the dark glasses and unmistakable stage presence, he was Ray Charles Robinson, a poor boy raised largely in Greenville, Florida. Music fascinated him early, Yet his childhood changed dramatically when he began losing his sight around age 5. By 7, he was completely blind, most likely because of glaucoma. In 1937, Ray was sent away to the Florida School for the Deaf and the Blind in St. Augustine. There he learned to read and write music in Braille and received serious musical training. Piano remained his main instrument, but he also learned clarinet and developed skills on several others. Classical composers such as Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven became part of his education alongside the blues, gospel, and popular music he heard outside school. Could you have looked at that 7-year-old boy entering a boarding school alone and imagined he would eventually become one of the most influential musicians in America? Ray's mother died when he was only 14, and afterward he left school and began supporting himself through music. He played professionally around Jacksonville, later moved to Orlando and Tampa, and endured periods when money was so scarce that he sometimes struggled to eat. By 1948, still only 17, he headed across the country to Seattle. There he formed the Maxon Trio and met a teenage Quincy Jones. Long before fame arrived, Ray Charles had already lost his sight, lost his mother, lived independently, and turned years of disciplined musical training into the foundation of an extraordinary career. Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston was an American singer and actress whose extraordinary vocal control eventually made her one of the most celebrated voices in pop and R&B. Yet that ability was obvious long before worldwide fame. Raised in Newark, New Jersey by gospel singer Cissy Houston, Whitney grew up surrounded by professional music and began singing at New Hope Baptist Church while still a child. Before she was 12 years old, Houston gave a church solo performance of "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah." Cissy later remembered that moment as the point when she realized just how gifted her daughter was. Whitney became a soloist in the junior gospel choir, learning phrasing, projection, and emotional delivery in front of a congregation rather than inside a recording studio. How many teenagers could go from singing in church to providing vocals on records by established stars before even finishing high school? By about 15, Houston was already singing background vocals for artists, including Chaka Khan and Lou Rawls, while also appearing in her mother's live shows. Those sessions exposed her to professional recording years before she released music under her own name. In 1983, while still only 19, Houston performed at a New York nightclub where Arista Records president Clive Davis saw her. He signed her and soon presented her nationally on the Merv Griffin Show, where she performed "Home from the Wiz." Years before the massive hits, Whitney Houston had already progressed from a gifted church soloist to a professional background singer and major label discovery, all while still in her teens. Janet Jackson. Janet Jackson is an American singer, dancer, actress, and songwriter who eventually became one of the defining pop and R&B performers of her generation. Yet her ability to command an audience appeared remarkably early. Born into the famous Jackson family, Janet made her professional stage debut in April 1974 at only 7 years old, performing songs and celebrity impressions alongside her brother Randy in the family's Las Vegas show. By 1976, she was regularly singing, dancing, and performing comedy sketches with her siblings on the CBS variety series The Jacksons. Her confidence in front of cameras soon opened another door. At about 11, she joined the sitcom Good Times as Penny Gordon Woods, demonstrating that her talent extended well beyond music. How many children could move from a Las Vegas stage to national television before they were even old enough to enter high school? Music eventually became Janet's main path. A&M Records executive Herb Alpert later recalled that the label signed her when she was only 15, recognizing that there was a serious artist behind the already famous Jackson name. Her self-titled debut album arrived in 1982 when Janet was just 16 years old. The record included the R&B single Young Love, marking the beginning of her solo recording career. Years before Control transformed her into an international superstar. What makes Janet's youth remarkable is her versatility. Before adulthood, she had already worked professionally as a singer-dancer, television performer, actress, and recording artist, building more than a decade of experience before the world finally saw her step completely out of her family's shadow. Beyoncé. Beyoncé is an American singer-songwriter and performer who first became famous with Destiny's Child before building a massive solo career. But the polished superstar audiences know today began as a surprisingly shy child in Houston, Texas. Her mother, Tina Knowles, later recalled putting Beyoncé in dance classes partly because she was so quiet around other children. At 7, that changed dramatically when Beyoncé entered a talent contest singing John Lennon's Imagine. Once she stepped on stage, her family saw a confidence they had barely seen before. By 9, Beyoncé had joined the young girl group Girls' Time, performing locally with future Destiny's Child members. Old footage shows a very different Beyoncé, a preteen in coordinated stage costumes, natural hairstyles, and energetic dance routines, rather than the elaborate productions of her adult career. The group even appeared on Star Search and Lost. Instead of ending the dream, the defeat was followed by years of intense rehearsals, vocal training performances, and lineup changes. Would you have guessed that the little girl who lost on Star Search would eventually become one of the most recognizable performers of her generation? Her father, Matthew Knowles, eventually left his corporate job to concentrate on managing the group while Tina designed their stage clothes. Girls' Time evolved into Destiny's Child, and by the time Beyoncé was only 16, the group had released its self-titled debut album and scored an early breakthrough with No No No, long before the arenas and solo stardom. Beyoncé's youth was already dominated by rehearsals, competitions, setbacks, and an unusually serious commitment to performing. Alicia Keys. Alicia Keys born. Alicia Augello. Cook is a New York singer, songwriter, pianist, and producer whose combination of classical training and R&B eventually made her an international star. Her musical ability developed remarkably early. Raised by her mother in Manhattan's Hell's Kitchen, Keys began classical piano lessons at 7 and was writing her own songs only a few years later. By 14, Keys was already developing material that would eventually become part of her debut album, Songs in a Minor. Manager Jeff Robinson remembered being stunned when the teenage Keys sat at a piano and performed her own compositions. To him, she already seemed unusually complete as both a singer and musician. How many teenagers could study classical piano, write original R&B songs, excel academically, and attract a major record label before graduating high school? Columbia Records signed Keys when she was only 15. At 16, she graduated as valedictorian from New York's Professional Performing Arts School and earned admission to Columbia University. She attempted college briefly, but the growing demands of her recording career convinced her to concentrate on music instead. The first label deal proved frustrating because executives wanted greater control over her sound and image. Keys eventually left Columbia Records and found a supporter in Clive Davis, who allowed her far more creative freedom. When Songs in a Minor finally arrived in 2001, Keys was only 20. It debuted at number 1, produced the massive hit Fallin', and earned her 5 Grammys. The astonishing part was that much of the artistic foundation behind that breakthrough had already been built while Alicia Keys was still a teenager. Lauryn Hill. Lauryn Hill is an American singer-rapper, songwriter, producer, and actress, best known for the Fugees and her landmark solo album, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. But long before the Grammys and locks that became part of her signature image, she was a determined teenager from South Orange, New Jersey, already moving between music, acting, and school. At just 13, Hill appeared on Showtime at the Apollo singing Who's Lovin' You. The notoriously demanding crowd reacted unevenly at first, but she pushed through the performance and finished to applause. While still in high school, Hill connected with Pras Michel and Wyclef Jean and joined the group that would eventually become the Fugees. She was not limited to singing. She developed as a rapper and songwriter while the young group performed around New York and chased record deals. At the same time, Hill was building an acting career. At 17, she landed a recurring role on As the World Turns, and the following year appeared opposite Whoopi Goldberg in Sister Act 2, back in the habit where audiences got an early glimpse of the powerful voice that would later define her music career. Watching Lauryn Hill sing in Sister Act 2, would you have guessed that this teenage actress was only a few years away from becoming one of hip-hop's biggest stars? Hill was also academically ambitious and earned admission to Columbia University. She initially tried to balance college with performing, but the Fugees soon signed a recording contract forcing music to take priority. Their first album arrived in 1994, when Hill was still only 19. Before worldwide fame, Lauryn Hill had already survived the Apollo, acted on television and film, entered an Ivy League university, and helped build a hip-hop group all before reaching her 20s. Monica. Monica is an American R&B singer, songwriter, and actress who became one of the defining voices of 1990s R&B. But long before The Boy Is Mine made her internationally famous, Monica Denise Arnold was already performing while most children her age were still figuring out what they wanted to become. Raised around Atlanta, she sang in church as a young girl, and by age 10 had joined the traveling gospel choir Charles Thompson and the Majestics. At only 11, Monica was discovered by producer Dallas Austin after he heard her perform Whitney Houston's Greatest Love of All. Austin offered her a recording deal with Rowdy Records, and Monica soon began spending her teenage years moving between school and recording sessions. Old images from this period show a remarkably young girl, braids, oversized 1990s clothing, and a youthful face, yet her singing voice already carried the confidence and maturity audiences would later recognize. If you had heard Monica sing at 11 years old, would you have believed that voice was coming from a child? Her debut album, Miss Thang, arrived in July 1995 when Monica was only 14. Don't take it personal. Just one of dem days and Before You Walk Out of My Life. Both became major R&B hits, giving her extraordinary chart success before she was old enough to drive legally in many states. By the time most teenagers were worrying about school dances and graduation, Monica was already recording hit records, touring, and building a career that would last for decades. Brandy Norwood. Brandy Norwood is an American R&B singer and actress whose distinctive layered vocals later earned her the nickname the Vocal Bible. But her musical ability appeared long before fame. Born into a musical family, Brandy began singing in church at just 2 years old, guided by her father, Willie Norwood, a gospel singer and choir director. By age 11, she was already entering talent competitions and performing professionally. Around that same period, Brandy began singing background vocals for the young R&B group Immature, giving her real studio and stage experience while she was still years away from high school graduation. She later recalled that record labels initially rejected her, with some executives believing she would be only a temporary success. How many 11-year-olds could face repeated rejection from record companies and still keep pursuing a professional music career? Her persistence paid off. At only 14, Brandy performed at an Atlantic Records showcase and secured a recording contract. Around the same time, she landed a role on the ABC sitcom Thea, showing that her talent extended beyond singing. Then came the breakthrough. In September 1994, at just 15, Brandy released her self-titled debut album. I Wanna Be Down and Baby became major hits, both reaching #1 on the R&B chart, while the album eventually went multi-platinum. Before most teenagers had decided what career they wanted, Brandy had already sung professionally, signed with Atlantic, acted on national television, and become one of R&B's youngest major stars. Chris Brown. Chris Brown born. Christopher Maurice Brown is an American R&B singer, dancer, and songwriter whose combination of vocals and athletic choreography eventually made him one of his generation's biggest performers. But his talent appeared long before fame. Growing up in Tappahannock, Virginia, Brown taught himself to sing, performed in his church choir, and became fascinated with dancing while still a child. At 11 years old, he won his first talent competition at a summer camp. By 12, Brown had decided that music was what he wanted to pursue. He studied performers including Michael Jackson, Usher, James Brown, and Genuine, practicing both singing and dance rather than concentrating on only one skill. Around 13, he began recording demos and was discovered by people in the music business who recognized how unusually developed his voice already was. How many teenagers could sing, dance, and perform convincingly enough to secure a major record deal before they were even old enough to drive? Brown was only 15 when he signed with Jive Records. A year later, everything accelerated. His debut single, Run It, reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Making the 16-year-old one of the youngest male R&B newcomers to reach the top with his first charting single. His self-titled debut album arrived in November 2005 and entered the Billboard 200 at #2. Before adulthood, Chris Brown had already moved from small-town talent contests to professional recording studios and the top of the American singles chart, turning childhood practice into a national R&B career at only 16. These stories prove that extraordinary talent often shows itself long before fame ever arrives. Some of these musicians were winning competitions, mastering instruments, writing songs, and performing professionally while they were still children. But here's the debate: is greatness something you're born with? Or is it created by years of discipline, pressure, and opportunity at a young age? Some of these stars looked destined for music almost from the beginning, while others had to fight through rejection before anyone believed in them. Tell us which young talent impressed you most, and subscribe to Black Legends Revealed for more incredible stories behind music's greatest legends.